Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'll go back one. I want to talk about virtual network services. So about a year ago at this time, Bell launched a virtual network services platform. And I want, if I could ask your indulgence, I want to take you on a little journey with me. I want to talk to you about a bit about why we did it, what was the thinking behind it. I want to go into a little bit about kind of how we saw the technology evolve, kind of what the vision around how we put that service together. I'm going to drop into 3 areas. Talk about the virtual edge. I'm going to talk about the digital experience. How do we want the client to experience the service? And I'm going to talk about orchestration. And then I'm going to touch on some of the lessons we learned along the way. I think whenever you transform, try to do something new, you learn some lessons. Some you learn the easy way, some you learn the hard way. And I want to talk about a few of those things. So the next chart, 2 important points. Things we thought about. What does the customer need? They need the network to adapt quickly. We need to transform and change the experience. And you go, hey, Jeremy, really? Right? Yeah, you're telling me you thought of those 2 things? Those are pretty straightforward things. Of course, customers need more. They need more flexibility. They need greater features. And of course, they need a better experience. I think, a lot of the services they've bought historically, have been very manual, very phone call, email oriented, not necessarily very digital. So no big surprise. How do you think about those 2 things? I think what's important to keep in mind is when you manage an enterprise network, a client manages an enterprise network, now they're shifting workloads to the cloud. So they're not all sitting in the data center or in their locations. Some are going to public cloud, some are going in different geographies across the country, and they've got a whole different attack surface now than they used to before. As clients start to digitally transform, the attack surface grows. There's more areas, more vectors that can be attacked as well. So the clients have to change their environment much faster than they did before, and they need the network from the provider to be able to do the same. How can I change policies? How I can change security? How I can do WAN optimization? How can I change those things quickly, knowing I have to make changes to support the changes that are occurring in the business? So we thought about that, and we thought about, how do we make it very simple and easy for them to do? Not only do we be able to turn the features on quickly, but be able to make it easy, put more control in the client's hands. Now, fortunately, and we've all seen the transition and the changes that have occurred in the cloud world, and with the hyper performance we have now coming out of compute, and now we're seeing ASICs that used to be doing very specific things, virtualized in software. We can now run VNFs on platforms, hardware platforms in the network world. Now that we're able to do those things, we said, okay, well, how do I make the network more cloud-like? How do I think about the pieces that are important to our clients and start to virtualize those? So our vision was okay, let's take advantage of the virtualization technology and think about it also obviously in an edge environment, but also take advantage of how software can define network paths and routes inside the network so client workloads can shift not just to the public cloud, but between their own data centers, their own locations. Simple things like, today clients buy multiple accesses. They might have a private network into one location, but sometimes the traffic coming from the location actually needs to go to the internet. It doesn't need to go all the way back to a data center somewhere. So how do you start to create that software flexibility that starts to manage the traffic and allow it to shift in different directions? So the simple principle was, hey, the technology has changed. It's more virtualized. How do I apply that sort of cloud principles to the network? So we started with that framework, that thinking, and how do we make some of it more on demand, more flexible, more as needed for the client? So we went into those 3 areas. The first one was to virtualize the edge. So let's launch a universal CPE, an edge device, and start to figure out what workloads, what the client cares about in that environment. In the traditional world, as you can see on the right, clients are stacking devices, right? Routers, firewalls, load balancers, all these hardware platforms with software on it being deployed everywhere. And when a client wants to go and do a firewall swap or an upgrade, there's trucks, there's people running all over the place to go and do that. And it's costly, it's time consuming, and it's not just the cost of the hardware, it's actually the time of the deployment. We've seen large accounts where sometimes it can literally take half a year to a year to do a national fiber or do a national firewall upgrade. Because you got to go into each location, change out the device, and make sure they're uniform and configured properly. So we said, first principle, we're going to virtualize the edge, put a high-performance compute platform there, universal CPE, and virtualize different workloads for the client. So we started down that path, and we saw the simple benefits of a simpler device means obviously a lower total cost of ownership from a hardware perspective for us and for the client, but it was really that reduced management complexity. I got to do a firewall change, now I'm spinning up a VNF inside a device. I'm not going to every single location and dropping and deploying more hardware. And being able to use some more of that sort of pay-as-you-go. I'm not going to buy a firewall, for example, for 3 years, or 4 years, and I have to sweat the hardware and the assets for a long period of time. I'm going to buy it on a software licensing model. If after a couple of years I want to change the firewall solution I have, well, I haven't invested in hardware that I haven't amortized that's still on my book. So pay-as-you-go a focus was important. And really, again, having that kind of on-demand model where you can actually try different software workloads over time, not be caught in this situation where you're buying heavy iron and having to amortize it over a long period of time. So the first principle, let's virtualize the edge. And then we very quickly realized, okay, well, clients will actually want more control. They actually know, in many cases, faster or better than us, depending on what the use cases are in the workloads. They want to be able to turn on features, and they know when. And in the traditional telecom world or network world, we're talking a lot of paperwork. Sometimes it's filling out forms, it's change orders, they flow through a process, they get into our environment, then they get down into the network teams that configure and make change. That doesn't work in this world. If the client actually needs to spin something up quickly, they need to do it in a digital and online way, like we're all used to doing in the consumer world. And I think one of the challenges we have is that, that gap is often widening, right? As a consumer, you can buy so much online, so many services, turn things up and down. And in the business world, it's not always the case. So you come into the office and you get frustrated by the environment you're in, because in the consumer world, it seems all easy. So we had to invest in really an online digital experience for our virtual network platform. And I refer to it as a platform because although a network is underneath it, a lot of it is really a software platform that allows you to turn features on and off as you need to. Then we had to get into all these human factors elements that, never thought about those before. Is it easier to show somebody a list of things, sites, a map, when they log back in, what order do they want to see things in? Do they want to see things they looked at last? Do they want to see the troubles first? So kind of a whole new element and a whole new paradigm to go and think through, because in developing services in a traditional telecom way, you don't think of all the human factors and interface elements that would occur in kind of the digital environment. And this became a big focus. It continues to be a big focus for us. Do we have it perfect? Absolutely not. Do we need to continue to involve it? Absolutely. So the second sort of stream of thinking after virtualizing the edge was, okay, let's really get our head around how the client wants to interact with the service. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of those lessons learned when we get to the end. The third piece was really figuring out the orchestration. You spin up a workload, you spin up a SD-WAN solution, you spin up a firewall, and on the surface you go, okay, well, I've spun up 2 services. But those services actually need to coexist, and they need to work together. So now you're getting into these complex elements of service chaining. Okay, well, how do I make sure a change that occurs in one platform doesn't affect the VNF next to it? And how do I make sure, that the ecosystem is sort of tested and works properly? So not surprising to us, now we actually found situations where even if you're buying the SD-WAN solution from the same hardware vendor, or you're buying the SD-WAN solution and the firewall sometimes from the same actual vendor, sometimes they actually don't work together. They don't work together as seamlessly as you'd like, or sometimes actually some of their orchestration mechanisms are different, because many of the platforms we used or consumed as part of the service, many of them were actually from companies that may have bought another company. So now maybe some of the inner working isn't as mature as it needs to be. So we had to do a lot of troubleshooting, understand the different use cases, understand all the kind of heuristics involved to go and make that service chain work. So the orchestration piece actually became probably the biggest and most complex area and evolution for us. Kind of the brains behind the service is the orchestration. Kind of the digital interface I showed in the previous slide is kind of the way the client experiences it, and kind of the virtualizing the edge actually became kind of the simpler component of it. So the orchestration piece is very, very software driven. And if I take you down a kind of a side note, a few of the speakers earlier mentioned they didn't have technical backgrounds. I confess I do. I'm a software engineer, and when I graduated university, I ended up coming and working for what my friends affectionately called the telephone company. And so it only took 20 years before I'm actually qualified for the software job that I actually got now. So it's ironic that the entire and platforms are now shifting to very much software, and it's very much software-based thinking. So the automation and orchestration really becomes the key kind of heart of the virtual network service platform. And this is I'd say the biggest journey that we'll need to continue on. Obviously continuing to find the right VNFs, continuing to evolve the digital experience, but the orchestration sort of becomes the kind of the heart and soul, and we're going to talk a little bit about that and how it relates to MEF in a few minutes. Here's a handful of things that the VNF, Virtual Network Services platform and deployments that we learned from. From a custom perspective, one of the big learnings, which you didn't expect, is we pre-packaged some of the solutions. And for certain clients, the pre-packaged, here's some basic routing functionality, here's the SD-WAN, here's a firewall or WAN optimization solution, pre-packaged, orchestrated, all set. And we had some clients say, well, you know what? I have my own licensing on this particular platform, so hey, could I bring the hardware to your edge and use my own licensing on the platform? Okay, we figured out some of those use cases and then those scenarios. And then the big surprising one is clients started to ask, well, hey, you've got a compute platform that you can virtualize services on sitting right in my location, so are there other services that I can put on that platform? Print servers, other things that they would then like to go and put on the platform. So the kind of the boundaries of what is a network became very, very blurry. Some of those use cases we will work through with clients. Some of them we went, hey, we're not ready to orchestrate very unique things for clients. We need to keep it somewhat standardized, automated, simple, or you can't get to scale, right? So it was a very, very interesting learning to find out that clients had very specific use cases, and we're actually really viewing it as a compute platform. More of a compute platform in some cases than a network platform. So very interesting learning for us. Not surprising, some of these other ones, hey, how do you extend it globally? And that's something that we're working through. The security implications as well. One of the unique things we figured out is many customers have large firewall deployments sitting inside their network. So after the edge, they've deployed a pretty comprehensive firewall systems or IDS, IPS, all these platforms, and it's very, very hard for them to evolve them and upgrade them. Again, because of that point I mentioned before, they're in locations all over the place. It often involves people configuring, putting devices in. So the ability to spin up firewalls and security service became a major selling point, because once the platform's there, you could actually spin up a firewall very easily in almost mass scale, across all the locations. So that became very, very valuable, more than we expected to clients. And then the proof of concepts was the other one. Clients love the concept behind some of the do-it-yourself interface, online capability, but they themselves actually don't have the sort of processes in their organization to do that. Like, who's authorized to do it? Well, today it goes through a process, maybe a change request, it's documented, paper-based. Now someone wants to click a button. Okay, well, who can click the button? Who in the client's organization understands what the implications of the button they're clicking are? So that became a very, very interesting learning, and that kind of resulted in the box to the far right, proof of concepts. Every single one, I can't think of a single exception where the client didn't say, okay, could we do a proof of concept first? So I can get my feet wet, I can get comfortable with both the digital interface and kind of what level of controls I have and who in the organization has the right authorizations to go and do those things. So that became a very, very, very critical element. In terms of sort of learnings for us in the company and the organization, that licensing example was probably one of the biggest learnings. Customer said, I want to bring my own licensing. Okay, I'm going to take the client's enterprise licensing on my hardware platform or their hardware platform. There are a lot of use cases and scenarios. Some worked out quickly, some we're still working out in some of the larger, more complex, sort of national thousands of location networks. And figuring those models out became very, very interesting, and I think will be a kind of a major part of how we need to think about evolving kind of virtual services as an industry. I think the usability, the sort of human factors elements of design, way more complex than we thought. I mean, you don't typically in some of the product development teams have someone who's got human factors experience, right? Who kind of knows what the right look and feel is, where people's eyes are going to go on a particular page. They don't know, is it table-based, a map-based, what's the best way and easiest way that people want to interact, with the information. So that became a big learning for us. And I think the other one, we've been doing both waterfall development for a long time, agile development as well. And we're used to, even on this project, doing a number of sprints around some of the releases, the first release, the minimal viable product, et cetera. we are surprised that, we really needed to keep that team running even through some of the, the next deployments or some of the unique use cases customers had. So you'd run a standardized development team running each of the releases, and then we'd be kind of onboarding and running little mini MVPs almost on a customer basis, just to make sure we hadn't missed anything, and we're really clear on the client scope and their requirements, because it's new ground also for the client when you get into virtualizing services and their level of interaction. That really resulted in us actually keeping really dedicated resources engaged. So when you go through the process of learning in our network teams and our IT teams, you've got to keep those teams together, right? So in many large organizations, ours isn't an exception, you often have cases where the resources, they join a project for a period of time, sometimes they're shared between other projects. And when it comes to doing something like virtual network services, keep everybody together, keep them together forever, or as long as you can, because the amount of intellectual property and learning and everything else that you build up, you really want that team to collaborate and work together on the next set of releases, because a lot of this is new ground or new technology, new frameworks, new standards, things that people haven't learned before. So you really want to keep those folks together. It helps expedite and move the next set of releases forward quickly. Just in terms of sort of connecting this back to some of the standards and the things that we've been talking about, very, very important, to keep in mind, one, that you're always going to see multiple sort of SD-WAN solutions and platforms, and having a framework around orchestration and inner working is absolutely critical. How are you going to go and scale some of these solutions outside of like sort of Canadian footprint as an example? We need some standards to go and drive that evolution. I think even pushing into standards around what that minimum almost digital experience needs to look like. If you think of the sort of second pillar I talked about, standards around virtualization and automation are sort of the third pillar that I talked about. That's absolutely critical. And then there's just going to be so many different platforms and scenarios out there that you need to have a common framework around APIs and interfacing into different technology. I think we're going to see some standardized catalogs of use cases, and then the world is just going to expand. Like in our work, and we found a handful of SD-WAN solutions that we liked, handful of firewall, load balancing, a handful of different solutions he wanted in each category. And that worked about 60–70% of the time, but there are always new solutions around the edges that clients would bring up, they'd ask about. And if we don't have a standard set of framework that the industry follows around those, how are you going to go and implement those things and scale those things, not just in, say, the Canadian fabric, but on a global landscape? So, standardization in this world is critical. So that's got to be a big focus, for the industry going forward. I'll finish by saying just a couple of things. I got the opportunity to obviously be up here to talk a little bit about what we did. And I am gracious to have the opportunity, because the real skills and intellectual property aren't mine. They come from the team within the organization. So there's a lot of Bell folks are here today that contributed and really made that service happen. And there's a lot of folks from the Bell team that aren't here today that are in Canada that really brought the intellectual property, the creative thinking. How do we go and figure out how to virtualize an edge? How do we figure out orchestration? How do we figure out that digital experience? So I think just sort of the culture, the efforts, the fantastic work of the team, I'm very proud of, and want to just publicly thank them for that. And thank you for your time and attention this morning. Very appreciated.